Well, I would also like to extend a warm greeting to everybody this morning. So good to see everybody. We've had I'd almost describe it a whirlwind, eh? It's hard to believe. Here we are right at the end of the year. Christmas time has passed, and it's my prayer that it has been a time that you've had opportunity to share time with family and to reflect on life and reflect on Jesus and his impact on us. Well, this morning we're going to spend a few minutes primarily in Matthew chapter 17 and the parallel passage in Mark chapter 9. So I would encourage you to turn in your Bibles to that. We will hyperlink over to a couple of other passages, but do want to have you where you can see that. You have that in front of you. So I'd like to actually begin my thoughts with something the Apostle Peter had stated near the end of his life, probably about 35 years or so after the events that occur in Matthew chapter 17. And in 2 Peter chapter 1, verses 17 and 18, Peter says, "The voice of the majestic glory of God said to him, 'This is my dearly beloved Son, who brings me great joy.' We ourselves heard that voice from heaven when we were with him on the holy mountain." Well, many of you probably can identify what this is referring to. Seems like we've had 2 or 3 Bible studies and maybe a sermon in the past 6 months on what is referred to as the Transfiguration, which is found in Matthew chapter 17. And here, Peter, who was one of the people that witnessed that, has made a reflection, has reflected back on that. And then another passage I'd like to refer to is Luke chapter 9, verse 43. Now, Luke chapter 9 is actually a third parallel passage, if you will, with Matthew 17 and Mark 9. I didn't want to confuse us too much. We're going to focus just primarily on the Matthew and Mark accounts. But Luke has a couple of good snippets, and I wanted to share with you something that Luke said at the end of this passage that we're going to take a look at. So we kind of got bookends. We've got something that Peter said years later, referring to the majestic glory of God at the time of the Transfiguration. And then after another event that we're going to look at today, Luke concluded all that with, "And they were all amazed at the majestic glory of God." And I just thought, that's really cool bookends for the story that we want to look at in Matthew chapter 17. So in Matthew chapter 17, the beginning and the Transfiguration, and I'm really using the Transfiguration as helping set up the scripture that we're going to look at today, but I wanted to cover a couple of points, and I think these few verses draw this out. So let's just take a look at Matthew 17, 2-3 and verse 5. There he was transfigured before them, that is Jesus. His face shone like the sun. His clothes became as white as the light. Just then there appeared before them Moses and Elijah talking with Jesus. And I should mention that them is Jesus and 3 of his apostles, Peter, James, and John. And of course, Peter had something to say. I left it out in the passage here, but Peter had a couple of things to say. But as Peter was still speaking, he was preempted by a bright cloud which covered them, and a voice from the cloud that said, "This is my Son, whom I love, and with him I am well pleased. Listen to him." You know, the phrase, I don't know if the phrase "a mountaintop experience" came from this or not, but this definitely was a mountaintop experience for Peter, James, and John. And it was probably a highlight or an inflection point or a notable milestone for Jesus himself to receive this voice from God, this very physical, at least audible confirmation of who Jesus was. And I don't know if as you've gone through the Christmas season, you know, it's kind of like a mountaintop experience for you. You know, it's certainly a mountaintop from expectations, right? We put lots of expectations on this time of year. And there's an old saying, I always like to say, there's an old Canadian saying. Equally appreciates that when I share Canadianism with him, but I suspect this is a little more than that. There's an old saying that says, what goes up must come down. And that's exactly what happens here. But how often do you have, you know, a very inspirational moment in life that you would consider a mountaintop experience, and then in a bat of an eye, all of a sudden, you're down off the mountaintop and you're right in the thick of day-to-day challenges, discouragements, and struggles. I think of Moses, when Moses was on the top of the mountain and got the tablets of the law from God. Boy, you talk about a mountaintop experience. And then what happened as soon as he came off the mountain, there's the people worshiping a golden calf. You know, all of a sudden he was, I don't want to use the phrase he was plunked into reality, because reality might have been what was on the mountaintop. But it's two different forms of reality. And it seems like Satan sits there in the valley. And when you come off that mountain and you come off that something that's very inspiring for you and in your life is that Satan lets you be. He lets you have that moment in the sun, and then he comes to attack. So let's take a look at what happens when Jesus and these three apostles come down off the mountain. Now we're going to read from Matthew 17, 14 to 18. And then we're also going to read Mark 9, 14 to 27. Interesting enough, the first reading, actually I'll make that comment in just a minute. Let's just go to that first reading. So in Matthew 17, 14 to 18. When they had come to the crowd, so this is as they've come down off the mountain, a man approached Jesus and knelt before him. Lord, have mercy on my son, he said. He has seizures and he's suffering greatly. He often falls into the fire or into the water. I brought him to your disciples, but they could not heal him. You unbelieving and perverse generation, Jesus replied. How long shall I put up with you? Bring the boy to me. And bring the boy to me. Jesus rebuked the demon, and it came out of the boy, and he was healed. Well, in the Mark passage, by the way, I love, and I know I've said this before, but I don't get tired of thinking of this, so hopefully you'll get tired of me saying it. We are having 4 Gospels, because we don't have just one account of something that Jesus does, you know, a teaching or an event. We have 2, 3, sometimes we have all 4 of them will comment on the same events. And so this event that we are reading about this boy with the seizures, we can actually find in 3 of the Gospels. And I have 3 slides. I had to use 3 slides to get Mark's account on there, because Mark gives a whole bunch more information to us about this event as we try to understand, well, what's going on here. Many of you might kind of go, well, Mark's the guy that's always, you know, immediately does this and he goes here and he, you know, and it's Mark tends to be more brief than the other gospel writers. But in this particular case, Mark he's giving a fuller, just a lot, I don't know, the word richer is better, but a lot more information than perhaps Matthew gave. Now, let's just pause for a minute. These gospel writers, Matthew and Mark, Well, Matthew is an apostle of Jesus. So Matthew is one of the 9 disciples. We're going to kind of get some insights from in a couple of minutes. Well, Mark, he was not one of the apostles, but it is believed that Mark had very close association with Peter. And some early writings after the New Testament period suggested that Mark actually was documenting really the story that Peter provided. So I just kind of put that out there. So Peter's one of the 3 that wasn't part of the 9. In other words, it wasn't this homogeneous group of 12 disciples, 12 apostles. They had been split here. 3 went up the mountain, and 9 stayed below. So think of that as we read through this. Okay, so this is the same account. Got a few more facts in it. When they came to the other disciples, they saw a large crowd around them and the teachers of the law arguing with them being the disciples. As soon as all the people saw Jesus, they were overwhelmed with wonder and they ran to greet him. "What are you arguing with them about?" he asked. And a man in the crowd answered, "Teacher, I brought you my son, who is possessed by a spirit that has robbed him of speech. Whenever it seizes him, it throws him to the ground. He foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth, and becomes rigid. I asked your disciples to drive out the spirit, but they could not." "You unbelieving generation," Jesus replied, "how long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring the boy to me." So they brought him, and when the spirit saw Jesus, it immediately threw the boy into a convulsion. He fell to the ground, rolled around, foamed at his mouth. And Jesus asked the boy's father, "How long has he been like this?" "Well, from childhood," he answered. "It has often thrown him into the fire or water to kill him. But if you can do anything, have pity on us and help us." "If you can," said Jesus, "everything is possible for the one who believes." Immediately the boy's father exclaimed, "I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief." When Jesus saw that a crowd was running to the scene, he rebuked the impure spirit. "You deaf and mute spirit," he said, "I command you, come out of him and never enter him again." And the spirit shrieked, convulsed him violently, and came out. The boy looked so much like a corpse that many said, "He's dead." But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up to his feet, and he stood up. Okay, so we've had 2 different gospel writers telling us the same account, and the accounts go together like this. And there are, let's say, 4 groups or individuals, actually 5, and we'll take a look at some of these different players, if you will, involved in this event that takes place. Well, in the book of Matthew makes reference to a crowd. Matthew actually just mentions the crowd, but has no other information. Mark and Luke, we didn't read Luke's account, but Luke identifies as a large crowd. Mark identifies something very interesting. The crowd includes Jesus' disciples. And not only did it include his disciples, the 9 of them, but it included teachers of the law. And the teachers were arguing with the disciples. So get a picture of this one, okay? So you're one of the 9. And this guy has brought, his son who has seizures to you. And keep in mind, you have already experienced the power of healing and casting out demons. Remember Jesus, earlier in Matthew, Jesus sent them out, and they went out, and they rejoiced when they came back, and they were amazed at all these things that they could do. So Jesus and the 3 of them go up on the mountain. Here's the 9 of them. Here's a guy. Hey, great. Come out. Whoop. Come out, please. And it's not happening. So not only is it puzzling for them, it's an embarrassment for them. And now you got the teachers of the law arguing with them. I wish I knew what they were discussing. But you can imagine they were probably taunting the disciples, you don't have power, you're fakes, you're frauds, and the disciples are arguing back. And so there's this big argument, this big crowd, and all this kerfuffle right at the time that Jesus and his other three disciples, apostles, come down the mountain. Interesting enough, when Jesus appears, they were overwhelmed with wonder and ran to greet him. Kind of an interesting thing. So that's the crowd that was involved. Disciples, and I probably touched on disciples because they were in the crowd, but let's cover them off again. The disciples, of course, they could not heal the boy. Luke doesn't really give us anything more about the disciples, but Mark does, that they were part of the crowd. They're arguing with the teachers of the law and probably over their inability to heal this boy. The man in the crowd, and that's what he was called. He's not given a name. Sometimes some of these people, like Jairus, the name is given, but this man's name was not given. He's the man in the crowd. The man in the crowd approached Jesus. Remember when Jesus came and everybody ran to Jesus? He must have been out front. That's kind of he either ran faster, maybe he's a good runner, or he just happened to be, at that edge of the crowd, because he seems to have been able to get to Jesus while the crowd was still making its way towards Jesus. Just a little sidebar. He knelt before Jesus. This man asked, "Lord, have mercy on my son. He has seizures and suffers greatly." He came to Jesus with respect. Remember that the disciples could not heal his son. So he was disappointed, sorely disappointed. Also, I just think back on that story of Jairus. And Jairus is the one who appealed to Jesus, and because his daughter was gravely ill. And then there was the woman with the issue of blood and distracted, and that man's like, my daughter is dying. Well, it turns out his daughter died. And very similar to this in that there's a major disappointment, but then there's still interaction with Jesus. The other passages give a little more insight. The man also called Jesus teacher. Both Luke and Mark refer to that. He makes this statement, "If you can do anything, have pity." Well, and of course, we already referred in the passage that Jesus came back with somewhat of a rhetorical question. If I can help? And the man, I think there's quite an insight here, an openness, a transparency with this man. He declares, "I believe, help me with my unbelief." Okay, and finally we'll take a look at the son and we'll take a look at the demon. So the son, we've already identified, he has seizures. We can see how Mark, you can read that for yourself, you can see how Mark just gives a whole bunch more information about the physical part of this. I would have actually thought maybe Luke would have given more of the details of that just because of Luke's background as a doctor, but it was Mark. Mark just in this particular case gave a lot more detail than he normally would. And the demon, the spirit. First of all, in Matthew, when the man came to Jesus, Matthew doesn't even reference that it was a demon that was causing the seizures. The seizures could be just a physical ailment, an epilepsy type ailment. But he does identify that there was a demon that was rebuked by Jesus. By the way, so something to understand here is that we have the boy with seizures and he has a demon. And it's interesting in Matthew chapter 4, it talks about Jesus went about healing people, different kinds of ailments, and it specifically said people with seizures and people that were demon possessed. And in this particular case, the two were together. So this boy was in big trouble. And I'm actually going to go back to the previous screen because I do want to identify. Luke actually did make a very interesting statement here about the boy. And he said, he says the spirit seizes him and he suddenly screams, even though he also was mute, but there was some kind of screaming that could occur. The boy is being destroyed by this spirit. I mean, this is a very dire situation. And I do want to just pause here and try to put yourself in the spot of that man. He's had a child that has constantly had seizures, constantly been thrown to the ground, constantly at danger from water and fire, and there's no solution in sight. He must just been heartbroken, and he's doing everything he can. And is that not just human? We have many of us here have children. And I know many have children perhaps with physical challenges that make it very, very challenging. And this is a sign of humanity that we're seeing in this story, that Jesus could, or that this man turned towards Jesus. So there's a sermon in there. It's not the core thought of today, but I did want to identify that we can certainly empathize with this man. So back to the demon. Again, it is interesting that Mark identifies that when Jesus said, "Bring the boy to me," and so the man brings the boy, and when the boy sees Jesus, when the demon in the boy sees Jesus, the spirit immediately throws the boy into a convulsion. It's almost like one last, I know I'm done for because I know who Jesus is. The demons recognized and knew who Jesus was, but he was going to do one more dirty deed, if you will, at that time. Okay, so out of this, we have these different characters in play. We've looked at the passages itself, and we see then we have this conclusion that God's majestic glory is revealed, that people could see the majesty of God because Jesus had healed this boy. Okay, something that we had not read before. So that's all to say. Let's now take a look at the key part of this passage in chapter 17, verses 19 and 20, because this is a private teaching moment. This is where Jesus takes his disciples. He was very critical of them. How long have I got to put up with you? It almost sounds like I'm getting tired of you. Would you step it up? You're missing, you're not meeting my expectation, etc., etc. But so afterwards, when they were with Jesus in private, and both Matthew and Mark make the same statement about being in private, why couldn't we drive it out? Remember, they haven't had a good day. Maybe a good 2 days. They went in perhaps with full confidence that they could heal this boy. They couldn't heal the boy. Not only that, we had all the teachers of the law that were were arguing and probably, as I say, taunting them, and they're dejected. They don't know what's coming. Of course, I think they probably learned that after a while, that whatever Jesus taught them tended probably not to be what they thought. He took what they said, and then he gave a solid truth. And in this particular, he does so too. He says, he replied, "You have so little faith. Truly I tell you, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, 'Move from here to there,' and it will move. Nothing will be impossible for you." Now, don't lose sight of the fact that Jesus is not giving them a geography lesson on how to move mountains. He's addressing their question, which says, why couldn't we drive it out? And there's actually 3 points in this that Jesus makes. And let's take a look at the 3, being this idea of you have little faith. So that's the first one. That's the response. You have little faith. This is not the first time Jesus has told them they had little faith. So very briefly, you can see in these 3 passages. The first passage is the idea of can you, God takes care of the birds. He will take care of you. He will take care of your possessions. And it was because What did Jesus invite the disciples to do, by the way, when he first called them? To come and be his disciples, be taught by him, and to have nowhere to live, have no money, wander around, not have all this stuff. So I suspect that in behind this, there's a lot of anxiety about, I'm not going to have the basic necessities of life. And he said, you have such little faith. In the second case is when they're all in the boat, major storm going on, and their life is threatened. And he challenges them and says, you have little faith. And then the third one is Peter, when Peter walked out of the boat onto the water, but then all of a sudden saw all the turmoil of everything that was going around, and he panicked, and Jesus said to him, you have little faith. By the way, I'm sure Peter remembered that when he came off the mountain with Jesus, and Jesus is saying to the 9 apostles that were left, oh, you little faith, and Peter's probably, yeah, I know, he told me that too, so now he's told you guys the same thing. But he also talks about mustard seed. For truly, if you have the faith the size of a mustard seed, you'll tell this mountain to do this and that. Well, this is a little perplexing. You have too little faith, so all you need is a little bit of faith. That's kind of what it sounds like. There's a mustard seed, by the way, if you can see it. It's very, very small. And so catch this point. He's not saying you have, like, you're looking at this going, well, if all I need is that amount of faith, what amount of faith do I have now? If I've got little faith, is it just a little piece of it? Is my faith now? And if I can just get to that level of faith, what's that, 3%? Maybe I'm just 1%. If I get to 3%, then I can do anything. Well, no, what he's saying is, and we can go back to another teaching here, is that in Matthew chapter 13, we go back about 4 chapters, he made another reference to the mustard seed. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, for which a man took and planted in his field. Though it's the smallest of all seeds, yet when it grows, it is the largest of the garden plants and becomes a tree. So it's dealing with progression here. So interpreting back, I think what Jesus is saying, my sense of what Jesus is saying is, you've got to have a faith that grows. Because if your faith stays here, the size of the mustard seed, it's got to grow. As the mustard seed grows, it's got to grow, or you have little faith. And then the third comment he made, we can actually I just do want to draw attention to this comment back with the man in the crowd who said, I do believe, help me overcome my disbelief. This is if you've never heard this passage before and this statement, write this one down. When you feel that your faith is slipping, your belief, your questioning, pray the same prayer that this man prayed. Lord, help me overcome my unbelief. I found it an amazing statement. This guy, boy, either he's quick thinking on his, because he kind of said, well, Jesus, if you can do something, would you? And probably realized that his lack of faith, mind you, he may not have any faith in Jesus. He had something. He had faith that he initially had faith that Jesus would heal. But his faith was hurt when the disciples couldn't heal. And so he said, well, Jesus, if you can. And then he quickly says, yeah, you know what? My belief isn't where it needs to be. Please help me with my unbelief. And that's prayer. This is a prayer. But it also identifies in one of our passages. It was in Mark 9. Just make sure I get this correct. When the disciples had asked him privately, why can't we drive this out? Jesus' response wasn't anything about mustard seed, wasn't anything about little faith. He just said, this kind can come out by nothing but prayer. So we got two examples in prayer. So the takeaway that I see in this passage is that it's an opportunity. Jesus found an opportunity to teach his disciples. And he's taking them on a journey of discipling, training. And he's using this major disappointment, major embarrassment on their part. I suspect that they got a little bit forgetting that the power came from God, and perhaps got thinking that they could do this themselves. And it wasn't because Jesus wasn't there. Remember, Jesus was up on the mountain, but it was, they took their focus off of God. And Jesus identified, you've got little faith, and you probably weren't praying, and you need to build your faith. Your faith needs to grow like a mustard seed, and prayer is the starting point, because faith is about intimate relationship with God and understanding that intimacy with God. Let me just end with Hebrews chapter 11, considered the faith passage. I just want to capture the first verse. Faith is the reality of what is hoped for, the proof of what is not seen. In the beginning of the next chapter, he writes, let us lay aside every hindrance and the sin that so easily ensnares us. Let us run with endurance the race that lies before us, keeping our eyes on Jesus. If you find yourself like the man in the crowd, challenged beyond description by pain and suffering and frustration, whatever your circumstances are, and you find yourself going, I don't have the belief, I feel it slipping, do what he did. I encourage you, I implore you. Jesus, I do believe, help me with my unbelief. That prayer is the starting point. Prayer is what really intimately joins us to God and is absolute key to building our faith. And if you're struggling with that, or if you don't even know what that means, if you don't know Jesus, and Jesus is just something you think about every 25th of December, or something, you don't understand that intimacy. It's that promise. We have faith that what has been promised to us of an intimate relationship with God and with Jesus in this life and having an eternal life, that's what it's about. And you have that opportunity. If you haven't come to Jesus, you haven't accepted Jesus, you haven't put him on in baptism, you haven't committed your life to be a follower, a disciple of Jesus, someone that shares this wonderful, wonderful, great news that we can have salvation through Jesus Christ. Let's sing our closing song at this time.